The crystal chandelier sparkled above as Maria wiped down the marble staircase for the third time that afternoon. Her hands were rough and red from years of scrubbing floors, but she worked quickly and quietly. That's what Mrs. Victoria Beaumont expected from her staff. Perfection, silence, invisibility. Maria had been working at the Beaumont estate for nearly 2 years now. Every morning she woke up at 5 to begin her duties. Every night she collapsed into bed exhausted. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. And steady was what she needed. Her mother's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. The mansion was buzzing with unusual energy that evening. Mrs. Beaumont was hosting one of her famous dinner parties, the kind where wealthy people gathered to show off their jewels, discuss their vacation homes, and remind each other how important they were. Maria had learned to stay out of sight during these events. The less Mrs. Beaumont noticed her, the better. "You there, girl," a sharp voice called out. Maria's heart sank. So much for staying invisible. She turned to see Mrs. Beaumont descending the staircase in an emerald green gown that probably cost more than Maria earned in a year. The woman's perfectly styled blonde hair didn't move as she walked, held in place by what Maria assumed was an entire can of hairspray. "Yes, ma'am." Maria kept her eyes down respectfully. "The music room. I saw dust on the piano bench this morning. If any of my guests notice, you'll be looking for a new job. Do you understand?" Maria nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I'll take care of it right away." She hurried toward the music room, her worn shoes barely making a sound on the polished floors. The truth was, there probably wasn't any dust. Mrs. Beaumont just enjoyed reminding the staff of their place. Maria had seen her fire 3 people in the past 2 years for minor mistakes. Nobody dared to talk back. The music room was Maria's favorite place in the entire mansion, though she'd never admit it out loud. The grand piano sat in the center like a sleeping giant, its black surface gleaming under the soft lighting. Large windows overlooked the garden, and the walls were lined with shelves holding old books and sheet music. Maria pulled out her cleaning cloth and began wiping down the piano bench, even though it was already spotless. As she worked, her eyes drifted to the keys. Her fingers twitched slightly. How long had it been since she'd really played? 6 years, 7? She glanced toward the door. Nobody was around. She gently pressed one key. Middle C. The sound filled the room, pure and clear. For just a moment she felt something stir in her chest, something she'd buried a long time ago. "Don't even think about it," she whispered to herself, pulling her hand back. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. The guests would be arriving soon. Maria finished her work and slipped out of the music room, heading back toward the kitchen where the other staff were rushing to prepare the evening's elaborate meal. An hour later, the mansion was filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Maria moved through the rooms like a shadow, refilling wine glasses and removing empty plates. The guests barely looked at her. To them, she was just part of the furniture. Mrs. Beaumont was in her element, showing off her home and bragging about her latest purchases. Maria overheard her telling a group of women about the antique vase she'd bought in Italy for $20,000. $20,000! Maria tried not to think about how many months of her mother's medication that could buy. Suddenly, there was a commotion near the entrance. Mrs. Beaumont's assistant was whispering urgently in her ear. Maria watched as her employer's face went from pleased to angry in seconds. "What do you mean he's not coming?" Mrs. Beaumont's voice rose above the chatter. Several guests turned to look. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the pianist called. "His flight was canceled. There's a storm up north and he can't make it." Mrs. Beaumont's jaw tightened. She'd been bragging all week about the world-renowned pianist who would be performing at her dinner party. This was a disaster. In her world, appearances were everything. Maria tried to slip away, but Mrs. Beaumont's eyes suddenly locked onto her. "You," she said, her voice cold. "Come here." Maria's stomach dropped. She walked over slowly, very aware that every guest in the room was now watching. "You clean the music room every day, don't you?" Mrs. Beaumont asked. "Yes, ma'am. And I've seen you looking at the piano. Tell me, do you know how to play?" The question hung in the air. Maria's mouth went dry. This was a trap. She could feel it. If she said yes, Mrs. Beaumont would mock her. If she said no, she'd probably be punished for wasting time in the music room. I used to play a long time ago." A cruel smile spread across Mrs. Beaumont's face. She turned to her guests with exaggerated excitement. "How wonderful. It seems we have a hidden talent among our staff. Since our professional pianist couldn't make it, perhaps our dear Maria can entertain us instead." The guests chuckled. Some looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. Nobody ever challenged Mrs. Beaumont in her own home. "Oh, I don't think—" Maria started. "I insist," Mrs. Beaumont interrupted, her voice sharp as glass. "Surely you're not refusing, are you? After all I've done for you, giving you this job when nobody else would?" Maria felt her face grow hot. She knew exactly what was happening. This was entertainment for Mrs. Beaumont. She wanted to watch Maria fail in front of everyone. She wanted to humiliate her, to remind her and everyone else present about the difference between the people who owned grand pianos and the people who cleaned them. "Come now, everyone," Mrs. Beaumont announced, gesturing toward the music room. "Let's see what our talented maid can do." The guests followed like a parade, their expensive perfumes filling the hallway. Maria walked behind them, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were shaking. This was a nightmare. The music room suddenly felt much smaller with 30 wealthy people crowding into it. They arranged themselves around the room, wine glasses in hand, smirks on their faces. This was the most excitement they'd had all evening. Mrs. Beaumont stood near the piano, gesturing dramatically toward the bench. "Please, Maria, don't be shy. Show us what you can do." Maria approached the piano slowly. Each step felt like walking through mud. She could hear people whispering, making jokes. One man laughed and said something about hoping the piano survived. Several people laughed with him. She sat down on the bench, her worn uniform looking shabby against the elegant surroundings. Mrs. Beaumont stood to the side, arms crossed, that cruel smile still on her face. She was enjoying every second of this. Maria's hands hovered over the keys. They were trembling. Her vision blurred slightly as tears threatened to form. She'd given up everything for this job. Her dreams, her future, her music, and now this woman wanted to take even her dignity. But then something shifted inside her. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was just the memory of her father's voice years ago, telling her that music wasn't about impressing people. It was about truth. She closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, and she placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes floated through the room like whispers, soft, delicate, almost hesitant. The guests exchanged glances, some still holding their wine glasses halfway to their lips, ready to laugh at whatever mess was about to unfold. But then something changed. Maria's fingers began to dance across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. The hesitant whispers transformed into a flowing melody that filled every corner of the music room. She was playing Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and technically demanding pieces ever written. The laughter died in people's throats. Mrs. Beaumont's smile faltered. She took a step back, her eyes widening as she watched this common maid, this girl she'd hired to scrub floors, command the piano like a master. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't the plan. Maria kept her eyes closed. She wasn't in the music room anymore. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far away from judgmental stares and cruel smiles. Her fingers moved with confidence, pressing the keys with just the right amount of pressure. Too hard and the melody would sound harsh, too soft and it would disappear. But Maria understood. She'd always understood. The music swelled and dipped like ocean waves. There were moments of pure joy, bright notes that sparkled like sunlight on water. Then the melody would shift, becoming darker, more melancholic. You could hear longing in it. Loss. Years of dreams pushed aside. Years of sacrifice. Maria wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was pouring her entire soul into every measure. An elderly gentleman near the window set down his wine glass carefully, afraid even the smallest sound might break the spell. A woman in a diamond necklace that probably cost more than a car had tears forming in her eyes, though she didn't understand why. The music was reaching inside all of them, touching something they'd forgotten was there. Professor Harrison stood frozen near the doorway. He taught at the city's most prestigious music conservatory. He'd heard hundreds of talented students over his 40-year career. He'd attended concerts by world-famous pianists. But this was different. This wasn't just technical skill. This was raw emotion transformed into sound. This was a story being told without words. He leaned toward the man next to him and whispered, "Who is this girl?" "Just one of the maids, I think." the man whispered back, unable to take his eyes off Maria. The professor shook his head slowly. No, she's not just anything. Maria's hands moved faster now, navigating the complex passages with ease. Her calloused fingers, rough from years of cleaning, seemed to know exactly where each key lived. There was no hesitation, no mistakes, just pure, unfiltered music flowing from her hands as naturally as breathing. Mrs. Beaumont stood rigid, her face pale. She'd meant this to be a joke. A moment of entertainment at someone else's expense. A reminder to everyone present about their place in the world's natural order. But the joke was on her now, and she knew it. Every second that Maria continued to play was another second of her own humiliation. The melody began to soften, approaching its conclusion. Maria played the final notes with such tenderness that several people in the room found themselves holding their breath. The last note hung in the air like a question that didn't need an answer. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Maria slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she seemed confused, like she'd just woken from a dream. She looked down at her hands on the keys as if surprised to find them there. Then she looked up at the crowd of people staring at her. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then someone started clapping. The elderly gentleman by the window. Then the woman with the diamond necklace joined in. Then another person, and another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. Not the polite, obligatory clapping you hear at boring dinner parties. Real applause. The kind that comes from being genuinely moved by something extraordinary. Maria stood up quickly, her face flushed red. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She was used to being invisible. Being noticed felt almost painful. That was remarkable, Professor Harrison said, stepping forward. His voice carried authority, and the room quieted down to hear him. Absolutely remarkable. Tell me, where did you study? Juilliard, the Royal Academy? Maria shook her head, looking down at her worn shoes. Nowhere, sir. I taught myself. A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the crowd. Taught herself? Impossible. Nobody played like that without years of formal training. You must have had some instruction, the professor insisted. Someone taught you technique. The way you handled those arpeggios, the emotion in your phrasing. That doesn't just happen. My father taught me when I was little, Maria said quietly. He was a musician. After he passed, I just kept practicing when I could. The professor looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but Maria was already moving toward the door. Excuse me. I need to get back to work. The kitchen needs help with the dessert service. She slipped out of the room before anyone could stop her, leaving behind a crowd of stunned guests who were all talking at once. Mrs. Beaumont stood frozen in place, her hands clenched into fists. Her perfect evening had been completely derailed. Everyone would be talking about the maid who played piano like an angel. Nobody would remember her Italian vase or her expensive gown. The help had stolen her spotlight. That girl is wasted as a maid, someone said loudly. She should be performing in concert halls. Did you see her hands? Another woman added. They were so rough, but the way she played. I've never heard anything so beautiful. Mrs. Beaumont felt her jaw tighten. She forced a smile and excused herself, heading straight for her private study. Once inside, she closed the door and grabbed her phone with shaking hands. This couldn't stand. She wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Maria leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Her heart was still racing. What had she just done? Mrs. Beaumont was going to be furious. She might even get fired. Cook, an older woman who'd worked at the estate for 15 years, squeezed her shoulder. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. And the most beautiful. I think I made a mistake, Maria whispered. No, dear. You did something true. Maybe the first true thing that's happened in this house in years. But Maria wasn't so sure. She knew Mrs. Beaumont. The woman didn't forgive embarrassment. And Maria had just embarrassed her in front of everyone who mattered in her social circle. Back in the music room, Professor Harrison was making his way to the butler. I need to speak with that young woman. What's her full name? How long has she worked here? The butler, a dignified man in his 60s, smiled slightly. It was rare to see someone recognize true talent regardless of social class. Her name is Maria Rodriguez. She's been with us for almost 2 years. Hard worker. Never complains. Lives in a small apartment across town with her mother, who's ill. The professor pulled out his business card. Please give this to her. Tell her I'd like to speak with her. It's important. I'll make sure she gets it, sir. As the party continued and guests gradually left, everyone was talking about the same thing. Not Mrs. Beaumont's expensive decorations or her designer gown. They were talking about Maria, the maid who played like she'd been trained by masters. The girl who made a room full of wealthy, jaded people feel something real for the first time in years. In her study, Mrs. Beaumont paced back and forth like a caged animal. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That girl had humiliated her in her own home, made her look foolish, and Mrs. Beaumont always made sure that people who crossed her paid the price. Always. She picked up her phone and began making calls. If Maria thought tonight had changed anything, she was about to learn a very hard lesson about how the world really worked. Maria couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling of the tiny apartment she shared with her mother. The performance kept replaying in her mind. The feel of the keys under her fingers, the shocked faces of all those wealthy people. Mrs. Beaumont's expression when the applause began, she'd probably be fired tomorrow. In the next room, she could hear her mother's labored breathing. The medication helped, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Maria turned over and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not now, not ever. The next morning, Maria arrived at the estate early as usual. Her stomach was in knots. She half expected Mrs. Beaumont to be waiting at the door, ready to throw her out. But the mansion was quiet. The guests were all gone. The staff moved through their routines like nothing had happened. Cook found her in the hallway around noon. "The butler wants to see you in his office." Maria's heart sank. This was it. She was going to be let go. The butler's office was a small, neat room near the kitchen. He was sitting at his desk when she knocked. "Come in, Maria, close the door." She did, her hands shaking slightly. "Sit down," he said, his voice kind. The butler had always been fair to her. She'd miss him. He pulled out a business card from his desk drawer. "A gentleman left this for you last night. Professor Harrison. He teaches at the Whitmore Conservatory of Music. Do you know what that is?" Maria nodded slowly. Of course she knew. It was only the most prestigious music school in the country, maybe in the entire world. "He wants to speak with you. He said it was important." The butler slid the card across the desk. "Maria, I've worked in fine homes for 40 years. I've seen a lot of talented people, but what you did last night, that was something special." "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble," Maria said quietly. "Trouble?" The butler smiled. "You gave those people something real to talk about. Something that mattered. That's not trouble. That's a gift." Maria took the card with trembling fingers. "Thank you, sir." "There's something else you should know," he said, his expression becoming more serious. "Mrs. Beaumont is angry. Very angry. I've been asked to watch you closely. She's looking for any reason to let you go, so please be careful." Maria felt cold despite the warm day. She'd expected this, but hearing it confirmed made it real. "I understand." That evening, after her shift ended, Maria stood outside the conservatory building. It was beautiful. Old stone covered in ivy with tall windows that glowed warm in the fading light. She could hear music coming from inside. A violin, then a piano, voices singing in harmony. This had been her dream once, a lifetime ago. She almost turned around and went home. What was the point? But something made her walk up those steps and push open the heavy wooden door. The receptionist directed her to Professor Harrison's office on the 3rd floor. Maria climbed the stairs slowly, looking at the photographs on the walls. Famous musicians who'd studied here, concert posters, awards and achievements. She knocked on the office door. "Come in," a warm voice called. Professor Harrison looked up from his desk and smiled. "Maria, I'm so glad you came. Please sit down." His office was cluttered with sheet music and books. A cello stood in the corner. The walls were covered with more photographs of students and performances. "I'll get straight to the point," he said, leaning forward. "I've been teaching music for 40 years. I've heard thousands of students play, but what you did last night was extraordinary. The technical skill, yes, but more importantly, the emotion, the truth in every note. That can't be taught. You either have it or you don't. And you have it." Maria didn't know what to say. "Tell me about yourself," he continued. "Where did you learn to play like that?" So Maria told him about her father. who'd been a session musician playing in small clubs and restaurants to make ends meet. How he'd bought an old, beat-up piano when she was 5 years old. How he'd taught her to play every evening after he came home from work. He'd say that music wasn't about impressing people, Maria said, her voice soft with memory. It was about telling the truth, about feeling something and letting it flow through your fingers. Your father was a wise man. He died when I was 12. Heart attack, sudden. Maria paused, swallowing hard. After that, music was the only way I could still feel close to him. I kept practicing on that old piano until the keys were completely worn out. And then, Maria took a deep breath. When I was 17, I applied to Whitmore. I never thought I'd get in, but I did. Full scholarship. I was supposed to start at 18, but you didn't. My mother got sick. Lupus. The medications are expensive and she couldn't work anymore. Someone had to pay the bills. Someone had to take care of her. Maria looked down at her hands. So I didn't go. I got a job cleaning houses instead. Eventually I found work at the Beaumont estate. Professor Harrison was quiet for a moment. That was 6 years ago. Yes, sir. And you've been practicing all this time? Maria hesitated. Should she tell him? But there was something about the professor's kind eyes that made her want to be honest. Late at night, after everyone's asleep, I sneak into the music room. I practice on Mrs. Beaumont's piano. I know I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. Music is the only thing that makes me feel like I'm still me. Like I'm more than just someone who cleans floors. The professor nodded slowly. And now Mrs. Beaumont knows you can play. Now she knows. Maria, I want to offer you something. He pulled out a folder from his desk. A full scholarship to Whitmore. Not just tuition. Room and board. A living stipend. Everything you need to study music properly. We have spaces for mature students. People who found their way to music later in life. You could start next semester. Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. This was everything she'd ever wanted. Everything she'd dreamed about during those long nights when she was exhausted from scrubbing floors and worried about her mother. But dreams didn't pay medical bills. I can't, she whispered. Why not? My mother needs me. The medical costs are over $3,000 a month. If I stop working, she won't get her medications. She'll get worse. I can't do that to her. She's all I have left. Professor Harrison leaned back in his chair, thinking, what if we could figure something out? There might be programs, assistance. I've looked into everything, Maria interrupted gently. We don't qualify for most help. We make just slightly too much, but not enough to actually afford everything. We're stuck in the middle. The professor looked sad. I understand. But Maria, talent like yours is rare. Letting it go to waste would be a tragedy. I know, Maria said, wiping her eyes. But sometimes life doesn't care about talent. Sometimes you have to make hard choices. She stood up to leave, but the professor stopped her. Wait, let me think about this. There might be options we haven't considered. Please give me a few days. Don't give up yet. Maria nodded, though she didn't feel hopeful. She'd learned a long time ago that hoping for things just made it hurt more when they didn't happen. As she walked back through the conservatory hallways, she passed a practice room where a young student was playing Mozart. The girl couldn't have been more than 19. She was good, but she kept making mistakes and starting over, frustrated. That could have been Maria. Should have been Maria. She stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the city, her mother was waiting for her. Dinner needed to be made. Medications needed to be sorted. Bills needed to be paid. Maria took one last look at the beautiful building behind her, then turned and walked toward the bus stop. Some dreams were meant to stay dreams. That's just how life worked sometimes. But as she rode the bus home, she didn't notice the black car that had been parked across from the conservatory, or Mrs. Beaumont sitting in the back seat watching her with cold, calculating eyes. The next morning, Maria was called to Mrs. Beaumont's study. She'd been dreading this moment since the dinner party. The butler's warning had been clear, but somehow Maria had hoped it wouldn't come to this. Mrs. Beaumont sat behind her massive mahogany desk, like a queen on a throne. Her expression was ice cold. Close the door and sit down. Maria did as she was told, her heart hammering in her chest. I've heard some interesting news, Mrs. Beaumont said slowly. It seems you've been meeting with people behind my back. Professor Harrison from the conservatory, wasn't it? Maria's mouth went dry. How did she know? Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Mrs. Beaumont leaned forward. I know everything that happens in this city. Everything. And I know he's offered you some kind of scholarship. Mrs. Beaumont, let me make something very clear. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. You work for me. Your time belongs to me, and I absolutely forbid you from accepting any scholarship or leaving this position. Maria felt like she'd been slapped. But ma'am, I'm not finished. Mrs. Beaumont stood up and walked to the window, her back to Maria. I've also learned something very interesting. You've been sneaking into my music room at night, using my piano without permission. Do you know what that's called? Trespassing. Theft of services. I could have you arrested. The room seemed to spin. I'm sorry. I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted to practice. You just wanted to practice, Mrs. Beaumont repeated mockingly. She turned around, her eyes blazing. You humiliated me in front of my friends. You made me look like a fool. And now you think you can just waltz off to some fancy school and leave me without a maid? I don't think so. I wasn't planning to leave, Maria said desperately. I told Professor Harrison I couldn't accept. Good, because here's what's going to happen. Mrs. Beaumont crossed her arms. You're going to stay here and continue your work. You will not contact Professor Harrison again. You will not play my piano ever again. And if you try to leave, I will make sure you never work in this city again. I'll tell everyone you're a thief. You'll never get a reference. No one will hire you. Maria felt tears burning in her eyes. Please, this is my dream. My one chance. Dreams are for people who can afford them, Mrs. Beaumont said coldly. You're a maid. That's all you'll ever be. Now get out of my sight and get back to work. Maria somehow made it to the hallway before the tears started falling. She leaned against the wall trying to breathe. Everything was falling apart. Mrs. Beaumont had all the power, all the control. There was nothing Maria could do. Are you all right, dear? It was Cook, carrying a basket of vegetables from the garden. Maria quickly wiped her eyes. I'm fine. No, you're not. Come with me. Cook led her to the kitchen and sat her down at the small table where the staff ate their meals. Within minutes, the other household staff had gathered. The butler, 2 other maids, the gardener, the driver, all of them looked concerned. Tell us what happened, the butler said gently. So Maria told them everything, about the scholarship, about Mrs. Beaumont's threats, about feeling trapped with no way out. By the end she was crying again and Cook had her arm around her shoulders. That woman is pure evil, one of the maids said angrily. She can't do this to you. She can do whatever she wants, Maria said hopelessly. She's rich. She has power. I'm nobody. The butler was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. There's something you all should know. Something I've kept quiet about for years because it wasn't my place to tell, but maybe now is the time. Everyone turned to look at him. Mrs. Victoria Beaumont wasn't born into wealth, he said slowly. Her real name is Vicki Brennan. She grew up in a trailer park in Missouri. Her father worked at a gas station. Her mother cleaned motel rooms. Maria stared at him in shock. But she's always talking about her aristocratic family. All lies, the butler continued. She married Mr. Beaumont when she was 23. He was 40 years older and very wealthy. When he died 5 years ago, she inherited everything. Then she completely erased her past, changed her name, made up stories about coming from old money, built this whole fake identity. How do you know this? Cook asked. Because I worked for Mr. Beaumont long before she came along. He told me her real story. He actually admired how she'd worked her way up from nothing. But after he died, she became someone else entirely. She pretends she's better than everyone, but she's just as common as the rest of us. Maybe more so because at least we're honest about who we are. Maria's mind was racing. Mrs. Beaumont had come from nothing too, just like her. But instead of showing compassion, she'd become cruel. She'd forgotten where she came from. Why are you telling me this? Maria asked. Because knowledge is power, the butler said, and because there's someone else who needs to know this story. Do you remember the elderly lady from the dinner party? Mrs. Eleanor Sterling? She's been a powerful figure in this city for 50 years. She chairs half the charity boards. Everyone respects her. And she does not tolerate cruelty or dishonesty. I remember her, Maria said. She was kind. She was also very interested in you after your performance. She's called twice asking about you. The butler smiled slightly. I think it's time Mrs. Sterling learned the truth about our dear Mrs. Beaumont. 2 days later, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling's car pulled up to the estate. She hadn't called ahead. She didn't need to. When someone like Mrs. Sterling wanted to visit, doors opened. Mrs. Beaumont rushed to greet her, all fake smiles and gracious hospitality. "Mrs. Sterling, what a wonderful surprise. Please come in. I'll have tea brought to the parlor." "That won't be necessary," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice cool. "This isn't a social call." Mrs. Beaumont's smile faltered. "Oh? I've learned some disturbing things. About you, and about how you've been treating your staff." Mrs. Sterling walked into the entrance hall uninvited, her cane clicking on the marble floor. Despite her age, she moved with authority. "Specifically about a young woman named Maria. I don't know what you've heard, but don't insult my intelligence," Mrs. Sterling interrupted. "I know you've been threatening her, trying to stop her from accepting a scholarship she desperately needs, using your position to keep her trapped in poverty. Does that sound accurate?" Mrs. Beaumont's face went pale. "That's a private matter between employer and employee. Nothing is private when it involves cruelty." Mrs. Sterling moved closer. "But what's really interesting is what I've learned about you. About Vicki Brennan from Missouri. About the trailer park. About the lies you've told everyone for years." Mrs. Beaumont looked like she might faint. "How did you—" "I have resources you can't imagine, and I have friends in every corner of this city." Mrs. Sterling's voice was cold as winter. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to release Maria from her position immediately. You're going to give her an excellent reference, and you're going to drop all this nonsense about theft and trespassing. And if I refuse, then I'll make sure everyone in our social circle knows exactly who you really are. The newspaper will be very interested in the story. The charity boards you sit on will ask for your resignation. Every door that's currently open to you will slam shut." Mrs. Sterling paused. "You've built your entire life on a lie. I can destroy it in a single afternoon." Mrs. Beaumont's hands were shaking. "You can't prove any of this, can't I?" Mrs. Sterling pulled out her phone and showed her a photograph. It was a young woman in a diner uniform, standing next to an old trailer. The woman looked different, but the eyes were unmistakable. It was Mrs. Beaumont from 25 years ago. "Where did you get that?" Mrs. Beaumont whispered. "I told you. I have resources." Mrs. Sterling put her phone away. "Now do we have an understanding?" There was a long silence. Mrs. Beaumont looked like she wanted to argue, to fight back, but she knew she was beaten. Mrs. Sterling had all the power now. "Yes," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "We have an understanding. Excellent. Have Maria's reference letter ready by tomorrow. And you'll never contact her or threaten her again. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear." Mrs. Sterling turned to leave, then paused. "You know, Vicki, I would have respected you if you'd been honest about your background. Coming from nothing and building a life is admirable. But being cruel to others who are where you once were? That's unforgivable. You should be ashamed of yourself." She walked out, leaving Mrs. Beaumont standing alone in her grand entrance hall, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. In the kitchen, Maria stood with the other staff members, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. The butler had heard everything and came to tell them immediately. "You're free," he said to Maria, smiling. Mrs. Sterling won the battle. Maria felt like she could finally breathe again. But there was still one problem. "My mother's medical bills." "Mrs. Sterling mentioned that too," the butler said. "She wants to speak with you tomorrow. I think she might have a solution." For the first time in 6 years, Maria felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Maria sat in Mrs. Sterling's beautiful living room, feeling completely out of place. The furniture probably cost more than her entire apartment building. Paintings that looked like they belonged in museums hung on every wall. But Mrs. Sterling herself was warm and welcoming, pouring tea like they were old friends. "I imagine you're wondering why I went to such lengths to help you," Mrs. Sterling said, settling into her chair with a gentle smile. "Yes, ma'am. I'm grateful, but I don't understand why you do this for someone you barely know." Mrs. Sterling set down her teacup. "When I was 19 years old, I wanted to be a doctor. This was 70 years ago, when women weren't encouraged to have such ambitions. My family was wealthy, but my father refused to pay for medical school. He said it was a waste of money, that I should focus on finding a husband instead." Maria listened quietly, surprised by this confession. "A woman named Dr. Patricia Chen changed my life. She was one of the only female doctors in the city at that time. When she heard about my situation, she personally paid for my first year of school. She told me that women with opportunities have a responsibility to help other women who don't have the same advantages. Mrs. Sterling's eyes grew misty. I became a doctor. I practiced for 40 years. And when my husband died and left me his fortune, I promised myself I'd do for others what Dr. Chen did for me. That's beautiful, Maria said softly. Your performance at that dinner party reminded me why I made that promise. You have a gift, Maria, and gifts like yours shouldn't be wasted because of circumstance. Mrs. Sterling reached for a folder on the side table. I've established a fund for your mother's medical care. All expenses will be covered for as long as she needs treatment. The best doctors, the best medications, everything. Maria felt tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to say. I can't possibly repay you. I don't want repayment. I want you to go to that conservatory and become the musician you were meant to be. And someday, when you're successful, I want you to help someone else the way I'm helping you. That's how we change the world. One person at a time. 6 months later, Maria stood backstage at the Riverside Concert Hall, her hands shaking. Tonight was her debut performance. Half the city's elite would be in the audience, along with music critics, journalists, and people who'd heard the whispers about the maid who could play piano like an angel. Professor Harrison appeared beside her. Nervous? Terrified, Maria admitted. Good, that means you care. He squeezed her shoulder. Remember what your father taught you. Music isn't about impressing anyone. It's about truth. Just go out there and tell your truth. Maria nodded, taking deep breaths. She was wearing a simple black dress that Mrs. Sterling had insisted on buying for her. Nothing too fancy. Nothing that wasn't her. Her mother was sitting in the third row, looking healthier than she had in years. The new treatment was working. She was actually getting better. The stage manager gave her the signal. It was time. Maria walked onto the stage and the applause was immediate and encouraging. The spotlight was bright. The piano waited for her like an old friend. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the sea of faces. And there, in the back row, she saw Mrs. Beaumont. Their eyes met for just a second. Mrs. Beaumont looked smaller somehow, diminished. Her social standing had taken a hit after word quietly spread about her treatment of staff. She wasn't invited to as many parties anymore. People whispered when she walked into rooms. But Maria didn't feel angry when she saw her. She felt something closer to pity. Mrs. Beaumont had everything money could buy, but she'd lost something more important. Her humanity. Her kindness. The memory of where she came from. Maria turned back to the piano and placed her hands on the keys. She'd chosen to play the same piece from that night at the dinner party. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece that had changed everything. The first notes filled the concert hall and the audience fell silent. But this time Maria wasn't playing for survival. She wasn't playing to prove anything. She was playing because this was who she was. This was her truth. Her fingers danced across the keys with even more confidence than before. 6 months of proper training had refined her technique, but it was the emotion that still set her apart. Every note carried the weight of her journey. The loss of her father, the sacrifice for her mother, the years of scrubbing floors while dreaming of something more, the kindness of strangers who saw her worth when others saw only a maid. When she finished, the silence lasted several heartbeats. Then the entire hall erupted. People were on their feet, applauding so loudly it sounded like thunder. Maria stood and bowed, tears streaming down her face. She looked at her mother, who was crying too. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd actually made it. After the performance, Maria was surrounded by people wanting to congratulate her. Music critics who were already writing glowing reviews. Wealthy patrons offering to sponsor future performances. Students from the conservatory who'd been inspired by her story. But the moment that mattered most was when her mother hugged her tight and whispered, "Your father would be so proud." 2 weeks later, Maria stood at a podium during a press conference. Professor Harrison and Mrs. Sterling sat beside her. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled notes. "I'm announcing the creation of the Rodriguez Foundation," Maria said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "This foundation will provide scholarships and support for talented young people from low-income families who want to pursue careers in the arts. Not just music. Dance, painting, writing, theater. Any creative field." A reporter raised her hand. "What inspired you to start this foundation?" Maria thought for a moment. "Because talent doesn't care about your bank account. It doesn't care if you live in a mansion or a tiny apartment. Genius can exist anywhere, but opportunity doesn't. We need to change that. Every person who has a gift deserves the chance to develop it. Who will the foundation be dedicated to? To my father, who taught me that music is about truth, and to everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. Everyone who's been judged by their circumstances instead of their potential. This is for all of us. The press conference ended with thunderous applause. Mrs. Sterling had donated the seed money to start the foundation. Several other wealthy patrons had already committed to contributing. The Rodriguez Foundation was going to be real. It was going to help people. 3 months after that, Maria received an unusual invitation. The Beaumont estate was hosting a charity fundraiser, and they wanted her to perform. The event would benefit a children's hospital, and all the biggest names in the city would attend. Maria almost said no. But then she thought about it differently. This wasn't about Mrs. Beaumont. This was about sick children who needed help. And maybe, just maybe, it was about coming full circle. She arrived at the estate on a cool autumn evening. The same grand entrance, the same marble floors she used to scrub. But everything felt different now. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't less than anyone here. The butler greeted her at the door with a warm smile. "Welcome back, Maria. Though I suppose I should call you Miss Rodriguez now." "Just Maria's fine," she said, hugging him. "It's good to see you." Cook peeked out from the kitchen and waved. The other staff members she'd worked with all found reasons to walk past and congratulate her. They were proud. She was one of them who'd made it out, who'd achieved something extraordinary. Mrs. Beaumont was there, of course. She had to be. It was her house, but she stayed on the opposite side of the room, avoiding eye contact. Maria noticed she looked tired, maybe even sad. When it was time to perform, Maria walked into the music room. The same piano, the same windows overlooking the garden. But she wasn't the same person who'd sat here terrified, expecting humiliation. She played beautifully. Not to prove anything, not to show anyone up, just because this was what she did now. This was who she was. After the performance, as guests mingled and praised her talent, Mrs. Beaumont approached slowly. They stood facing each other, two women whose lives had collided in the strangest way. "You've done well for yourself," Mrs. Beaumont said quietly. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. "Thank you," Maria replied simply. "I suppose you think I got what I deserved." Maria shook her head. "I don't think about it that way. What happened brought me here, and I'm grateful for where I am now. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." She walked away, leaving Mrs. Beaumont standing alone. Maria didn't look back. There was no satisfaction in anyone's downfall. There was only the music, the opportunity to help others, the chance to live the life her father had dreamed for her. As Maria drove home that night past the glittering city lights, she thought about how strange life could be, how one moment of cruelty had accidentally opened a door to her dreams, how the people who tried to push her down had actually helped her rise. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. "How did it go?" her mother asked. "It was perfect," Maria said, smiling. "Everything is exactly as it should be." And for the first time in her life, she truly meant it.